They killed the supreme leader of Iran, and they still lost the war. I want you to sit with that for a second, because nobody in Washington is willing to say it out loud. They got the headline, the video, the photo of the funeral procession stretching for miles through Tehran, everything a war planner would want on the day it happens. And somehow, 4 months later, the United States Navy is back to blockading Iranian ports. American aircraft are flying their 6th straight day of strikes, and Iran just told the world that the Strait of Hormuz is what they called a red line. None of that resembles winning. I have spent my career studying the difference between a battle and a war, and what we are watching right now is the most expensive lesson in that difference this country has paid for in 50 years. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because the story Washington tells itself is not the story that happened. In late February, the United States and Israel launched a joint strike inside Iran. They went after military sites, government sites, command infrastructure, and they killed several senior officials, including the supreme leader himself, in what amounted to a decapitation strike. From a purely tactical standpoint, that is about as clean an operation as modern air power has ever executed, with precision timing, coordinated Israeli and American assets, and almost no warning beforehand. Nobody serious disputes the technical execution, but tactics are not strategy. A tactic tells you how to win a single engagement. A strategy tells you what happens after you win it, how the enemy adapts, how the region reacts, how you actually walk away with the outcome you wanted. And that is precisely where this entire campaign fell apart, because nobody in that planning room seems to have asked the only question that actually matters, which is, then what? Because here we are. The man is dead. His son Moshtaba has technically inherited the position, and Moshtaba has not appeared in public since his father's funeral concluded. Think about that for a moment. You decapitate a regime expecting collapse, expecting capitulation, expecting a population to rise up and thank you for liberating them from a dictator. Instead, you get silence from the very man who is supposed to be running the country during an active war. No address to the nation, no public appearance, no signal at all of who is actually making decisions in Tehran right now. In my experience, that kind of silence from a new head of state in wartime is not usually a sign of weakness. It is usually a sign that the people underneath him, the security apparatus, the Revolutionary Guard command structure, are still sorting out who actually controls the machinery of the state. And if that is true, then Washington has spent months negotiating toward an exit with a government whose real chain of command nobody outside Tehran can verify with any confidence. You cannot negotiate an off-ramp with a ghost. You cannot build a memorandum of understanding on an assumption about who is actually going to enforce it. That is the first crack in this entire strategy, and it has barely been discussed anywhere in the mainstream coverage of this war. Now, here is the part that should genuinely worry people, and I do not say that lightly. This war was built on a specific assumption from the very first day. The assumption was that Iran, once its leadership was removed and its air defenses degraded, would essentially run out of ways to fight back in any meaningful sense. That assumption was wrong, and the evidence for that is not theoretical anymore. It is sitting in the Strait of Hormuz right now, in the wreckage of a bridge outside Bandar Abbas, in the darkened power grid across Hormozgan province. Iran does not need a blue water navy to make this war unbearable for everyone involved. It does not need a modern air force capable of contesting American air power directly. What it has is long-range missiles, drone swarms it can launch in numbers, nobody in the initial planning fully accounted for, and persistent overhead surveillance that lets it track shipping and military movement across the Gulf in something close to real time. That is a fundamentally different kind of war than the one this country's military trained for over the last 2 decades. And here is the part that should really land. By every measure that matters, missile stockpiles, drone output, the willingness of the population to keep absorbing this, Iran is in a stronger position today than it was on the morning this war started, not a weaker one. That mismatch, more than any single strike or any single ceasefire announcement, is the actual story here. I want to slow down here for a moment because the drone and missile piece of this gets treated as a footnote when it should be treated as the headline. For 20 years, American military doctrine in that region was built around a fairly simple premise that air superiority equals control. You take out the enemy's air force, you take out their command and control, and from that point forward, you own the sky, which means you own the tempo of the war. That premise held up reasonably well against Iraq in the 90s and again in the 2000s. It does not hold up against what Iran has actually built because Iran was never trying to fight an air war against the United States in the first place. They looked at how that kind of fight goes for everyone who tries it, and they built something else entirely, a combination of distributed missile batteries that are hard to find and even harder to eliminate all at once, drone production that does not require the kind of advanced manufacturing-based sanctions were originally designed to choke off, and overhead surveillance, some of it commercial, some of it not, good enough to track American and allied movement and time their strikes for maximum disruption rather than maximum casualties. That is a cheaper war to fight than the one the Pentagon prepared for, and cheaper wars are much, much harder to end through overwhelming force because there is no single center of gravity left to destroy. You can win the air campaign completely and still be fighting the same war a year later because the thing you actually needed to defeat was never in the air to begin with. So let's talk about what is actually happening on the ground this week, because it tells you everything about where this is heading. The ceasefire that was announced back in the spring, brokered with outside mediation, is dead. It survived roughly 3 weeks before Iranian forces resumed striking commercial vessels transiting the strait, which triggered a fresh round of American retaliation. The United States restored a full naval blockade against Iranian ports and coastal areas earlier this week. American forces disabled an Iranian oil tanker that attempted to run that blockade. This is now the 6th consecutive day of American strikes inside Iran, and those strikes are reaching as far as the north of the country, well beyond the coastal zone everyone originally assumed would remain the primary battlefield of this fight, except geography and proximity to American basing. This is not a contained conflict anymore, if it ever really was. It is bleeding across the entire Gulf, and every government in that region understands exactly what that means for their own stability. And through all of that, Iran has made its actual objective completely clear, and it is not what most casual observers assume. It is not purely about survival anymore, in the way it may have been back in February. Iran has shifted towards something closer to extraction. Reports out of the region describe an effort by Iran's Revolutionary Guard to essentially operate a toll system inside the strait, allowing certain vessels to pass in exchange for payment while continuing to threaten and strike others who refuse or who are tied to the American and Israeli side of this conflict. Whether you want to call that a blockade or a business model almost does not matter, because the practical effect is identical either way. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that stretch of water every single day. And Iran has demonstrated repeatedly across months now that it can turn that flow on and off depending on what it wants that particular week. That is real physical geopolitical leverage that does not depend on Iran winning a single battle, and no amount of American air power has been able to take it away from them, because you cannot bomb geography or airstrike a shipping lane into no longer mattering to the global economy. And I would push back on anyone